The Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the first international Psycho-immunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. Introduction to Taoism and Crowdsourcing into the Canadian Government, presented by Mark Cantwell.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening, or wherever you are.
Okay. So Mark Cantwell is Chief Strategist for Crowdsourcing and Open Innovation for the Canadian Federal Department of the Environment. In his 31 years of service, he has held a variety of posts, including Operational Weather Forecaster, Canadian Representative and Negotiator to the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity, Senior Water Policy Advisor, Director of the Water Survey of Canada, and developer of Canada's Strategic Framework for Integrated Environmental Prediction. Mark holds a bachelor's degrees in physical geography from University of British Columbia and meteorology from the University of Alberta. He has a master's degree in environmental management from Simon Fraser University and a postgraduate degree in strategy and innovation from Oxford University. So, pleasure to have you here, Mark.
Thanks for inviting me, everybody. This is great, and for those who are listening, how many folks have we got tuned in?
So we have 85 attendees in addition to the panelists here on Zoom, and then there's a few more that were watching on Facebook before that.
Okay, great. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for the invitation. Well, Grant asked me to speak to you about a series of personal events that happened to me about 7 or 8 years ago. It caused a bit of a paradigm shift in how I think about the world and how I move through the world and how I make decisions, and how it led me to do the work that I currently do, which I'll talk about towards the end of this chat. But there's a couple of things I want to mention before I get going here. My work and the work that Grant does is totally different. And it's, my relationship to Grant is kind of like the movie Back to the Future. I'm Marty McFly, and and I think of Grant as Doc, right? This crazy scientist working on time travel in his DeLorean. So I'm just praying he doesn't, epigenetically regress me back into time, that I end up having to fight off my mom who wants to have sex with me or something like this, right? So I've lectured in many. Just kidding, Grant. I've lectured in many countries around the world over the last few decades, and I've learned that the best way of imparting information and having it retained is to tell stories, right? And that's what I want to do today. I want to tell you a personal story, but I need to emphasize that I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a therapist. In fact, I barely understand on an intellectual level what you folks are doing and how you do it. But I may just have an inkling, kind of on a more visceral level, of what you're trying to achieve, and that's what I want to relate to you today, and I hope it resonates in some way. So let me start my story. So it begins about almost a decade ago. I was in my mid-40s. I was living near Ottawa, and I had this beautiful house, big house on an acreage that I was living on. I had a good career. I was married, 2 beautiful children, and kind of living the idyllic life. But like I said, by the time I was in my mid-40s, I was miserable. I didn't like anything that I was doing. The only thing I kind of enjoyed were my children. And I had a great career, but I just did not like it. It didn't speak to me. I didn't really care for the people I worked with, to be honest. The physical geography, which was cold all the time, freezing Canadian winters. Oh, my son has just popped up. I'm doing a live thing, so can you walk that way? Sorry, folks. So it was very tough, and basically what I was doing is I was going through this midlife crisis, midlife transformation, and I couldn't get a handle on it. And it's an interesting thing in our culture, Western culture, for those of you in other places around the world, is when folks, or certainly people like me, go through this stage, there's really no one to help us. We have no mentors in our culture. And so when we go through these existential crises, when we don't know, when we're unhappy with what we have and we really don't know what we want, we don't know the word I, we don't know what I is because we've never really understood who we are. There's no one to help us. And so we have to figure this stuff out on our own. And that's exactly what I try to do. A lot of men tend to regress, and there's the classic midlife crisis modes that they go through. I was a little bit lucky. I started to go inside my noodle instead of outside. And I just started to explore. So I explored through meditation, sessions, 10-day long Vipassana sessions. Ayahuasca loomed as well. But things, one night I was reading about Taoism, and there was an ex-physicist who had a website, and he was talking about these kinds of things. And it really spoke to me. And I remember it was like 10 o'clock at night. Saturday night, it was like minus 30 outside. And I wrote this fellow a little email saying, I really like what you're expressing. It really speaks to me. Maybe one day we can talk. And I sent off this little email, one-liner, didn't think I'd hear back. And 5 minutes later, my phone goes. And it's this guy calling me from his home in Hawaii. And I'm like, I didn't think we'd ever speak. But he said, well, it sounds like you want to talk now, not, 6 months from now. So we spoke for about an hour. And we spoke a week later for another hour, and a week later. And so we continued on this process, and he became kind of a consigliere to me. And after a year, I went to go live with him to do kind of a one-on-one sessions for a couple of weeks, kind of intensive. And it was, what he did is every day we would go to a different part of the Hawaiian island. He was on the Big Island, and I won't mention his name, although if you want to contact me, I can kind of broker a little hello if you want, but because we're still in touch after 10 years. He would take me to different parts of the island. And so for the first day, for example, we would stay, we'd be sitting in a beautiful idyllic pond with the waterfall and the birds, and we'd talk about life and so forth. And at the end of it, he'd say to me, how do you feel? And I go, I feel great. And he kind of look at me and go, oh, okay. And then the next day he would take me to another place, the sacred green sand beach. And we'd sit there for a few hours. And he'd say at the end of it, how do you feel? And I go, I feel fine. So you go, look at me, okay. Well, we kept doing this every day until I think about the 6th or 7th day, he took me to Mauna Kea. And that's where all the telescopes are laid out. And I remember there was one telescope I just walked over and I looked through it, and it was trained on Jupiter. And as I looked at this, it just blew my mind. I don't know why that particular thing did it, but just the act of seeing this thing in the flesh, so to speak. I was like, look at this, right? Call the cops. It's amazing. And I turned to my teacher, and he said, yeah, come here. I said, have you seen this? He goes, yeah, I've seen it. Come here. This is what I've been waiting for. I go, what are you talking about? He says, I've been waiting for you to feel a sense of awe and wonder. And the problem is in your life, Mark, is you have used your brain to conduct your life for, and you've been very, very successful at it. You've achieved all these things that you wanted to achieve, but the problem is your goals have been the wrong goals, and you've been using your brain to pick your goals rather than your heart or your spirit. And the reason why this feeling is so important is it helps you to decide what you should be doing. Because at any moment in time, there are an infinite number of lines of potential of things that you can do. And so how do you navigate? How do you choose that line of potential? So he suggested to me the way you do it is by tuning into this feeling. And even sometimes if you have the feeling, you can use that as a guide, even if it looks like it's a stupid decision. It will turn out to be the right one. So he said, look, tomorrow, just go rent a car. Go be a tourist. We're going to take the day off. I said, okay. So I rented a car, and I just decided to drive around randomly on the Big Island. And I thought the first place maybe I'll go is to the Kalapana lava fields. And just looking at the time here. So I went there. There was only one person in the parking lot. And the Kalapana lava fields is this big expanse of lava that had erupted 40 years earlier. And I drove up and I got out and I started to look, and there was a park ranger there. I was the only person there, and she turned to me and she started to explain, "Welcome, aloha, welcome to the Kalapana lava fields. The lava hasn't, there hasn't been an eruption in 40 years." And the moment she finished that sentence, lava came spewing out of the ground about 60 feet in front of us and about 50 feet up in the air. And there was the volcano erupted as we were looking at it. And it was an amazing feeling. And I had this feeling of awe. And I watched this for a few hours as everybody on the island, went crazy and started to drive to come and watch this event. After a couple of hours, I drove off and I started to navigate the island, to circumnavigate. And so as I was driving on what was called the Red Road, on the very southern part of the Big Island, I had the sea cliffs to my right and I had the jungle to my left. And I'm driving and this feeling comes over me again. So thinking about how I need to listen to this, I pull over on the side of the road and I get out and I look around and I'm just bathed in this sense of wonder. A few minutes later, get back in the car, drive back to Hilo, finish my sessions the next day and the following few days with my teacher. And I go home, go back to Canada. Over the next 2 years, I continue to try to work this idea of tuning into this sense of wonder and using it to guide my decisions. And one of the things I decided to do is, because of the nature of my work, I was asked to write an innovation strategy. And long story short, it ended up with me basically unilaterally just going to Oxford and to learn about strategy and innovation, because I thought it felt right. There was no logical reason to do it, but it just felt right. And I had no background in the subject, but I did it anyway. And it turned out to be a very useful thing, as I'll explain in a moment. But after about 2 years of this, I got called into my office, and my senior managers were there. And they said, "We'd like to make you Chief of Climate Services for Canada. What do you think?" And the moment they said it, I had this, again, this epiphany that spot in the jungle that I had seen 2 years earlier, I knew I had to go live there and homeschool my children. I have two boys, which was a totally irrational decision. But it felt right, and it was this feeling. So I thought, well, what I've been doing my whole life hasn't really worked for me in terms of making me happy. So why not do something different? And the mantra came to me in my head, which was, mantra is fuck fear. Don't be afraid to do this. So basically I stood up and I walked out of the office after being with them for 25 years. Went home, told my wife at the time, we're selling everything we own. I'm pulling the kids out of school, and we're going to go homeschool the children in the jungle. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that were going on the side, but basically that was it. Completely irrational. My friends said I was crazy, but I was going to do it. Now, I remember when I got out of that car 2 years earlier, there was a signpost. It was a mile marker. I won't say what mile marker it was, but mile marker X. And I thought, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to figure out how to live in a hut in the jungle and homeschool my boys? It's insane. But I was convinced I needed to do it. So I thought, okay, I'll go ahead of the family and I'll rent a house in the closest town, which is Hilo. And I'll use it as a base to drive down to this mile marker and figure out how to do this and then send for the family. Now, here's where it gets freaky. This is where it gets non-coincidental. I went on the classified ads in the Hilo newspaper and I found one house to rent for a couple of months, and they came with a truck. So I phoned the people up and I said, "Hey, I'm Canadian. I'd like to rent your house." And they said, "Well, we love Canadians." "Sure." I said, "Well, I'll be there in a couple of days." They said, "Great, we'll pick you up at the airport." I kissed the wife and kids goodbye. I told them I'd send for them. I flew into Hilo. This older couple picked me up. They took me home. They showed me their beautiful home. They said, "We'll leave in a few days to go to the mainland for a couple of months and you'll take over." And then they made me dinner. And as we're having dinner, they said, "So why are you here? Are you just a tourist?" And so I started to explain this whole story, knowing that they're going to think I'm nuts. And I said, I need your house as a base to drive to mile marker X on the red road to figure out how to live in a hut in the jungle. And they turned to each other and they looked at each other and they dropped their knives and forks. And they looked at me and they said, we own that land. And behind the tree line, behind that marker, is we have huts with solar panels and shower facilities. We use it as a private retreat. We never thought about renting it before, but we'll show you tomorrow. And the next day, we drove down there, and it was the same damn spot I had seen 2 years earlier. I had found it. It had everything I needed. So I sent for the family. And now, interestingly, just because I'd had a place to put my head didn't necessarily mean it would be right for the children, and I didn't know how to homeschool. Well, in the jungle next door was a circus school for children. And it had been conceived with a vision of a bunch of jugglers that were living communally there, that they would build this circus school for kids to give them self-confidence and to bring the community together and to do sustainable living. It took them 25 years to build. So it had been operating for about 5 years by the time I had got there. And they had one office space in this structure, and it was the Hawaii State Homeschooling Association with curricula and books, and I had everything I needed. And so in the morning, I would teach my children. We'd sit on the edge of the sea cliffs and watch the dolphins breach and the odd whale breach, and I'd spend some time with the boys teaching them whatever they want. And then we'd do our math and our English, and then we'd have lunch. And in the afternoon, they'd go off to circus school and play with the Hawaiians, the Hawaiian children. So it was really an idyllic situation. And ever since then, I've been trying to follow this approach to moving through the world. Now, unfortunately, I could only stay for about 6 months, and I decided to come back to Canada, but I didn't want to go back to Ottawa. And we settled on Vancouver Island, on this small island off of Vancouver Island, where I had a kayak, and we kayaked to and from the mainland for groceries and so forth. And it was, again, another idyllic situation. And after a year, my employers called me back, and they said, well, we let you go for a year, leave without pay, and it's time to come back home. And I said, I'm not coming back, not unless you post me to the West Coast and get me an office at the university and let me work on what I want to work on. And they said, well, what do you want to work on? And I said, I want to work on the stuff I learned at Oxford, which was crowdsourcing and open innovation. And they said, well, what's that? So I explained it to them, and they said, oh, well, yeah, that's really could be important. So yeah, you do that. And so that's what I've been doing for the last several years. And with that, I'd like to kind of segue into what crowdsourcing is and what I've done over the last little while for the Canadian federal government as a result of kind of finessing my way through this approach. By the way, Shane, how much time do I have?
Another 5 minutes is fine. Even
Okay.
a little bit longer if you want. Yep.
Okay, thank you. The idea of crowdsourcing relates to asking the crowd for help. And it could be crowdfunding. Many of you are familiar with crowdfunding, which is you're asking folks to, excuse me, you're asking people through the internet to help fund a particular project, and everybody gives a little bit of money, and it adds up to a lot of money. So crowdfunding is a type of crowdsourcing. If anybody's familiar with the website Reddit, well, that's a kind of crowdsourcing because it's crowd voting. And there's a number of different ways you can look at crowdsourcing, but the thing I was interested in was solving scientific and technical problems using a reward to ask the crowd to help solve that challenge. And so it's not a new idea. It's been around actually since the 1700s. I mean, some of you may know that the measuring latitude accurately is actually a crowdsourced problem. Very interesting challenge that you might want to look up the story about. But and so I work for the Meteorological Service of Canada, which is in part Environment Canada, so very technically oriented. And in Canada, we've never done this. We have never, at least at the federal level, used a platform to pose a challenge for a reward open to anybody in the world to help solve. And so I wanted to bring this approach And in order to do that, I had to kind of knock down some legal barriers, administrative barriers, financial barriers, and cultural barriers to do this. And I'm happy to say that as of, well, last year, I was able to knock all those down and undertake the first pilot study. So we did 3 challenges for a reward. It was open to anybody in the world, and we had those challenges solved. So a precedent was set, and now anybody in the Canadian federal government can solve challenges using this approach. And there are many different platforms out there now, maybe a couple of dozen, that that offer a venue for you to put your challenge on and then have it solved by a crowd. And often they curate their own crowds. Sometimes they have 2 or 3 million scientists and engineers just trolling their website, looking for problems to solve. And I'm about to, so I finished, that was like phase 1. But phase 2, it has to do with acculturation. And what I mean by that is the only other organization that I knew that was doing this kind of work was NASA. And so I flew down to the Johnson Space Center a couple of years ago, and I picked their brains for how they were formed, how they were created. And they gave me some interesting ideas, but they told me that when they first allowed the scientists to do this, nobody would use it. And nobody would use it because, number one, they were afraid to admit a problem. You know, they didn't want to admit they had a problem they couldn't solve to the world. And the second challenge was their cultural, again, was like they were thinking, well, we're NASA. If we can't solve it, nobody can. And for a couple of years, this tool remained unused until this sort of very bright manager realized, well, what if we created a crowdsourcing environment that was strictly internal to NASA? And that's what they did. So they created this process, this mechanism where anybody on their desk, on their computers could pose a challenge, and it would be seen by every employee in NASA, but only within NASA. And that way they became less reticent to use this tool. And after they started to use it and it actually worked and they actually started solving problems, it wasn't a big jump to then go international and open it up to everybody. And so my phase 2 of my project is to undertake to build this internalized system where staff in Environment Canada, and in fact in some of the other government organizations, at least internally, we can pose challenges to each other, and this becomes now a tool for acculturation. So I'll be starting that hopefully next week. Actually, we'll start getting to go on that. And so that's my arc of my story so far, is shifting from a very confused and unhappy person to finding this approach where my brain lit up and using it to navigate myself to where I am right now, which is much happier and more useful to people. And I think that's all I have to say about that. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. But I'll leave it up to you now, Shane.
Let me see. Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily any questions. So you want me to introduce the panel and then you'll explain how the panel is going to work? Sure. Yep. Okay. So we're going to have the next session is around, one of the key things here is around, these amazing models and techniques that how do we get this out to the mainstream? It's been one of our biggest business challenges. So Mark's going to facilitate this next session. So on the panel, so Kirsten's going to be joining us again. So for those that weren't here at the start of today's session or at the yesterday's session, Dr. Kirsten Lagarde is one of our co-directors of research at the Institute. She is a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, holds a PhD in pharmacology, and has 17 years experience in medical research focusing on appetite regulation, obesity, and type 2 diabetes. I'm going to be on the panel as well. For those that weren't here at the start of the day, I'm the CEO, the clinic director, the HR director, and one of the certified trainers at the Institute. I've got a background in strategy consulting, HR director, and working in New South Wales government. Daniel Soboski, he spent a career in traditional healthcare, from home support worker to medical technician, paramedic and nurse. He's expanded his practice to a whole new level of holistic healthcare through EFT, ancestral clearing, and now as an ISPS trauma therapist student. And Matthew Learning specialises professionally in conscious communication, sales, group facilitation, and investor relationships. So as you can see, we've got quite a variety of backgrounds for this panel discussion. And I don't have any other information as far as panel members. Is that all I'm going to say for now, Mark?
That's fine. Yes.
Yep. Good. Okay, so I'll hand over to you to let everyone know how this session is going to work.
Okay. Actually, Shane, I just want to make sure that as these questions come in, they're recorded, like textually, right? And you're able to save those?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay, so for those of you who tuned in yesterday morning, Grant sort of mentioned that the community has developed a critical mass now of psychobiological related therapies. And so the Institute now needs to shift into developing a strategy for how to make these treatments more widely available, right? How to mainstream these things. And so this means figuring out how best to make the world aware of these treatments to do three things. It seems to me to do three things, and then anybody on the panel can correct me. So the first thing is we have to let the world know that these techniques exist, that they're broadly accepted as safe and valuable treatments, and that they're readily accessible. Okay, and obviously it doesn't seem to be a better time to make that happen now that the globe is in a state of lockdown crisis. So these are three possible goals of a strategy, okay, which is what we want to discuss at this panel session. And actually, this really isn't going to be a typical panel discussion. What I thought we could try to do today is take the opportunity to kind of co-develop ideas for how to mainstream these therapies through a process, what we call ideation. This means crowdsourcing these ideas by having everyone listening to my voice out there to actually contribute their thoughts and ideas. And we as panelists, those ones who actually have the voice, can discuss their potential pros and cons. So I encourage everyone who's listening to contribute your ideas during the next 90 minutes or so as we panelists suggest options. And there's an interesting statistic that you should be aware of. And when I talked about my crowdsourcing ideas earlier, 70%, there was a study done in Harvard that 70% of all the challenges that get solved through crowdsourcing are solved by those outside of the discipline in which they originated, okay? So don't be shy about contributing your thoughts, even if you may not be specifically focused on, on what the Institute is doing exactly. Okay, so how are we going to structure our discussion? Well, I think we should keep it fairly, free-flowing with the panelists raising initial ideas to which the crowd can respond. But and I can start us off by raising a few areas of discussion. But the first thing well, one of the things, the way that I think about these things is I first try to identify sort of opportunities and barriers that are preventing reaching the goals, right, in the first place. And I do this with something called a PESTLE model framework, right? PESTLE just means looking at a problem from inside the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal space. Okay, PESTLE, P-E-S-T-E-L, within which these goals exist. And this is kind of how Steve Jobs functioned. And I know that Grant is a real Jobs fanboy, so that's why I kind of picked this approach. But before I do that, I think we need to get a little bit of a historical background. I think this has been peppered throughout the last 2 days, but can somebody on the panel, maybe Grant or Kirsten or Shane, provide a quick overview of what the traditional approaches are for mainstreaming treatments in society, okay, what they typically are, what the Institute has done to pursue these approaches in the last 10 years or whatever, and why they failed. This doesn't have to be detailed, but just kind of a broad-brushed overview of what you tried and what failed, so we don't have to go down that road during our discussions, okay? Is there somebody that wants to take a crack at this?
Thank you for watching. For more information, please visit www.pigstage.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel.